The void of space was never meant to harbor secrets like these. Across the mid-rim, star systems churned with the smoke of battle, fragments of destroyed droid fleets drifting in the stillness as if to warn the galaxy of what was to come. Yet the Clone Wars, for all their chaos, had prepared the Republic for almost every conceivable threat. Every threat, that is, except what suddenly appeared without warning. One moment, the hyperspace lanes carried the familiar patterns of commerce and patrol. The next, a tear in reality itself appeared, glowing faintly like a wound in the very fabric of space. From that rift, a vast fleet emerged, ships unlike any the galaxy had catalogued. They were enormous, hulking constructs of unknown metal, their silhouettes bristling with weaponry that emitted a deep, resonant hum across the vacuum. And within and among these ships moved beings of impossible size, walking like living towers upon the decks of colossal carriers, their armor gleaming with a utilitarian sheen that spoke of generations bred for war. These were the Zentraedi, and they had entered the galaxy unbidden. Sensors across Republic outposts failed to identify the incoming vessels at first. Navicomputers blinked warnings of unidentified mass, but the signals defied classification. Communications officers reported faint, irregular energy emissions, unlike any hyperdrive or weapons signature ever recorded. Within the Jedi Temple on Coruscant, the Council's monitors lit with frantic alerts as Master Yoda, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and Mace Windu reviewed reports of uncharted fleets descending upon key mid-rim systems. Unfamiliar, this presence is. Dangerous, yes, but predictable it is not, Yoda murmured, his eyes narrowing as he studied the streaming tactical data. It was a moment of unparalleled tension. The Republic had never faced a foe so massive, so organized, and yet so alien in approach. Jedi were deployed immediately, dispatched to analyze and, if necessary, intercept the incursion. Clone legions were placed on high alert, though the Senate had yet to grasp the magnitude of the threat. On the frontier planet of Kalarba, the first clash began without fanfare. Clone units stationed to protect the agricultural sectors watched from armored bunkers as enormous figures emerged from dropships the size of cities. The Zentraedi moved with precision, establishing perimeters and securing landing zones as though the planet had been theirs to conquer for decades. Their weapons discharged in controlled volleys, not to destroy indiscriminately but to assert dominance over the surface. When the first reports reached Jedi scouts, panic and awe intermingled. A clone battalion commander radioed frantically, "Sir, these are not droids, nor Republic infantry. They are enormous, and they're coordinated beyond any tactics we know." The first confrontation on Kalarba was almost ritualistic in its scale. Jedi intervened to prevent unnecessary slaughter, attempting to communicate, to probe the motives of these strangers. Master Obi-Wan, with Anakin Skywalker at his side, approached a landing zone where a Zentraedi officer, towering nearly 3 times their height, observed the Republic soldiers with a gaze as calculating as any general. Obi-Wan ignited his lightsaber, its blue blade cutting through the haze of ionized atmosphere, a symbol not of attack but of authority and caution. The officer responded not with words but with an array of mechanical signals, and in a terrifying display, deployed a squad of mecha that moved with disciplined efficiency, surrounding the Jedi without aggression. The first lesson became clear. These were not mindless warriors, but beings who understood strategy, hierarchy, and the rules of engagement in ways that dwarfed even the clone army's training. Meanwhile, the Separatists had observed the arrival with growing interest. Count Dooku, aboard the Invisible Hand, considered the potential of this new force. An advantage beyond our own droid fleets, yet uncontrollable, he noted, running simulations of potential alliances and risks. The Zentraedi, while formidable, were autonomous in judgment within their command structure. Dooku's advisors suggested cautious overtures. An alliance could turn the tide of the Clone Wars if these titans could be manipulated. But there was no guarantee of obedience. The Jedi, too, recognized the danger and dispatched urgent messages across the mid-rim, warning of an invader whose presence challenged the very assumptions of galactic warfare. The Zentraedi, for their part, were unconcerned with the politics of the Republic and Separatists. Their focus was the systematic assessment of this galaxy, the securing of resources, and the preparation for what they instinctively knew would be a war on a scale that few in the stars could comprehend. In the vacuum of orbit, their capital ships shimmered with energy fields, engines thrumming at immense power. Every battle station and fighter pod deployed like a living organism, responding instantly to any threats detected. Clone pilots scrambled in their gunships, unable to match speed or firepower. Droid armies moved like insects beneath the shadows of these giants, fragile and ineffectual against beings designed entirely for war. Reports flooded Coruscant, hyperspace lanes disrupted, entire trade routes blocked, and planets forced into quarantine to prevent panic. Republic intelligence attempted to catalog the Zentraedi ships, but conventional scans could not penetrate their alloys or read the signals emitted from their command nodes. Jedi historians whispered to each other in disbelief. The level of organization, the scale of the fleet, the sheer mastery of combined arms strategy, it was beyond anything documented in the annals of the Republic or the ancient Jedi archives. The galaxy was confronting a military civilization that had never been seen outside of myth and speculation. Despite their formidable presence, the Zentraedi were not without limits. Their dependence on centralized command structures meant that rapid, unpredictable tactics could disrupt their operations. Jedi and clone forces, though initially overwhelmed, began to study their patterns, recognizing that while individual Zentraedi were nearly unstoppable in single combat, their fleets could be deceived and divided. Obi-Wan noted these vulnerabilities, speaking gravely to Anakin as they observed the first skirmishes. Powerful they are, yes, but rigid. Use the Force wisely, and their own order can become their weakness. On Kalarba, the first casualties were recorded. Clone forces, caught in the immense shadow of Zentraedi Mecca, suffered staggering losses, yet their sacrifice provided critical intelligence. Droid units deployed by Separatists were annihilated with brutal efficiency, demonstrating the unparalleled physical might of the invading race. Civilians were evacuated where possible, Jedi mediating the chaos as best they could. Yet even as destruction unfolded, a strange awe pervaded the battlefield. These were warriors whose existence transcended any previous understanding, operating with a discipline and purpose that was both terrifying and strangely honorable. By the end of the first day of confrontation, the galaxy had already changed. The Zentraedi had no interest in diplomacy, their mission was expansion and conquest, a military mandate embedded in their DNA. The Republic had been humbled by a force that did not recognize senators, votes, or treaties. The Separatists had been offered a glimpse of power beyond their imagination, and yet one that could never be fully controlled. Jedi, for the first time in generations, faced an enemy they could not simply reason with, a threat immune to lightsaber strikes and to the conventional tactics of the clone army. As night fell over the mid-rim worlds, the hum of Zentraedi capital ships and the distant echo of mecha deployment reverberated through space. Jedi strategists convened emergency councils, attempting to map the alien threat and develop contingency plans. Anakin Skywalker, ever impulsive yet insightful, suggested rapid strikes against landing zones and communication hubs to disrupt cohesion, while Obi-Wan emphasized patience and the use of terrain to their advantage. Meanwhile, Yoda meditated, seeking clarity through the Force, sensing a ripple unlike any he had encountered, a vast consciousness bound not by the Force but by logic, discipline, and martial instinct. If you want to see more characters enter the Star Wars galaxy, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character you'd want to see in the comments below. The stage had been irrevocably set. Hyperspace lanes lay threatened, entire star systems quivered under the shadow of towering warriors, and the galaxy had glimpsed a form of warfare it had never known. The Zentraedi had arrived not as conquerors seeking alliances or treaties, but as a living, breathing embodiment of martial supremacy, challenging every assumption the Jedi, Republic, and Separatists held. Their arrival was not a singular battle, it was the opening act of a conflict whose ramifications would ripple across the stars, changing strategies, morals, and alliances in ways that could not yet be predicted. Every observer knew that the next engagement would be decisive, and that the galaxy, already torn by war, was about to face a force that even the bravest could not ignore. The Zentradi did not hesitate, nor did they pause to study the galaxy in cautious increments. Their doctrine was absolute: assess, deploy, dominate. Within hours of their arrival in the mid-rim, additional fleets began emerging from the same fractured hyperspace corridor, each one reinforcing the first wave with terrifying efficiency. What had initially seemed like a single incursion quickly revealed itself as something far more dangerous: a sustained invasion force. Entire sectors, already destabilized by the Clone Wars, suddenly found themselves caught between three powers instead of two, and unlike the Republic or the Separatists, the Zentradi did not negotiate, did not posture, and did not retreat. They advanced. On Kalarba, the battlefield evolved rapidly. Clone troopers adapted as best they could, repositioning heavy artillery and coordinating aerial support to counter the towering Zentradi infantry. LAT gunships roared through the smoke-filled skies, unleashing volleys of laser fire at the massive invaders. The results were mixed. Standard blaster fire, even from heavy cannons, seemed insufficient against Zentradi armor. It slowed them, staggered them, but rarely brought them down unless concentrated in precise, sustained bursts. The clones quickly learned that mobility and coordination were their only advantages. Anakin Skywalker stood at the center of the chaos, his robes scorched and his expression hardened by the reality unfolding around him. A Zentradi battle unit advanced toward a fortified Republic position, its massive rifle discharging blasts that obliterated entire defensive lines. Without hesitation, Anakin sprinted forward, leaping high into the air with the Force amplifying his movement. His lightsaber struck the armored plating of the giant's weapon arm, carving through it with a hiss of molten metal. The Zentradi staggered, momentarily disoriented, and that was all the clones needed. Coordinated fire poured into the exposed sections of its armor, finally bringing the behemoth down. "Focus fire on the joints," Anakin shouted over the comms, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Don't try to match them in strength, outmaneuver them." Nearby, Obi-Wan Kenobi directed clone units with calculated precision, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the devastation around him. He observed the Zentradi formations carefully, noting their reliance on structured advance patterns and synchronized movements. "They fight like an army that has never had to adapt," he remarked to Commander Cody. "Efficient, yes, but predictable once you understand their rhythm." Yet even as the Jedi began to exploit these patterns, a new complication emerged. Zentradi mecha units, sleek, agile machines piloted by equally massive warriors, entered the fray. Unlike the infantry, these machines moved with startling speed, their thrusters allowing rapid repositioning and aerial dominance. Clone gunships found themselves outmatched, forced into evasive maneuvers as energy blasts tore through their formations. Within minutes, Republic air superiority on Kalarba collapsed. In orbit, the situation was even more dire. Republic cruisers attempting to establish a defensive perimeter were met with overwhelming force. Zentradi capital ships dwarfed even Venator-class star destroyers, their weapons capable of crippling multiple vessels in a single coordinated strike. Admiral Yularen, overseeing the engagement, issued urgent commands as Republic ships struggled to maintain formation. "All vessels, break formation and engage independently. We cannot allow them to concentrate their firepower." It was a desperate tactic, but a necessary one. The Zentradi thrived on structured engagements. Breaking that structure, even temporarily, created openings. Republic pilots exploited these gaps, targeting exposed weapon arrays and attempting to disrupt the enemy's firing patterns. Losses were still severe, but the Republic began to learn adaptation, not brute force, would be the key to survival. Elsewhere, the Separatists moved quickly to capitalize on the chaos. On the bridge of his command ship, Count Dooku observed the Zentradi engagements with a mixture of intrigue and caution. Holographic projections displayed their formations, their weapon capabilities, and their apparent lack of interest in negotiation. "Fascinating," Dooku mused, his voice calm yet tinged with curiosity. An army bred solely for war, yet lacking the subtlety of political ambition. They could be a powerful tool, or a catastrophic liability. General Grievous, standing nearby, was less contemplative. "They are strong," he rasped, his mechanical voice filled with anticipation. "But strength alone does not win wars. Allow me to test them." Dooku nodded slightly. "In time. For now, we observe. Let the Republic exhaust itself against this new enemy. Then we will decide how best to proceed." The Separatists began deploying reconnaissance droids into Zentradi-controlled sectors, gathering data and probing for weaknesses. Early reports confirmed what the Jedi had suspected. The Zentradi relied heavily on centralized command signals, coordinating their forces with near-perfect synchronization. Disrupting these signals, even briefly, caused localized confusion, a rare but exploitable flaw. Back on Kalarba, the fighting intensified as Zentradi reinforcements continued to arrive. Entire regions of the planet fell under their control, transformed into fortified zones with astonishing speed. Massive structures were erected almost overnight, serving as command hubs and staging grounds for further expansion. The Republic forces, stretched thin, could do little more than delay the inevitable. Amid the destruction, something unexpected occurred. A small group of Zentradi soldiers, separated from their main unit during a chaotic skirmish, encountered a cluster of civilian refugees hiding within a ruined settlement. The towering warriors paused, their weapons trained on the defenseless beings before them. For a moment, the scene held its breath. Then, instead of firing, one of the Zentradi lowered its weapon slightly, its posture shifting in what could only be described as hesitation. It was a fleeting moment, but one that did not go unnoticed. A nearby Jedi, sensing the disturbance through the Force, observed from a distance. There was no clear understanding of what had transpired, only a faint impression that these warriors, despite their conditioning, were not entirely devoid of choice. The implications were profound. Anakin, upon hearing the report, frowned. "They're not just machines or mindless soldiers," he said. "There's something else there, something we can reach." Obi-Wan was more cautious. "Perhaps. But we must not underestimate them. Compassion can be a strength, but also a vulnerability." As the Republic struggled to hold its ground, the Zentradi continued their relentless advance. Hyperspace routes near Kalarba were effectively cut off, their fleets establishing a blockade that prevented reinforcements from arriving. Communications became sporadic, and supply lines were severed. What had begun as a single incursion had now evolved into a full-scale occupation of key strategic systems. Across the galaxy, panic began to spread. Reports of giant warriors and unstoppable fleets circulated among civilian populations, fueling fear and uncertainty. The Senate convened emergency sessions, debating how to respond to a threat that defied conventional understanding. Some called for increased militarization, others for diplomatic outreach, though few believed diplomacy would succeed. In the shadows, Darth Sidious watched with quiet satisfaction. The arrival of the Zentradi had introduced a new variable into his carefully constructed plan, but it was not an unwelcome one. Chaos, after all, was a tool, and the more chaos that consumed the galaxy, the easier it would be to reshape it according to his design. "They will serve their purpose," Sidious murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "Whether they realize it or not." The Clone Wars had already pushed the galaxy to its limits, but the Zentradi had changed the equation entirely. No longer was this a conflict between Republic and Separatists. It had become something far greater, far more dangerous. A struggle for survival against a force that knew nothing but war. And as the fires of Kalarba burned brighter, visible even from orbit, one truth became impossible to ignore. The galaxy was no longer prepared for what was coming next. The spread of the Zentradi across the mid-rim did not follow the slow, grinding expansion typical of galactic wars. It unfolded with unnerving precision, as though every movement had already been calculated long before their arrival. Systems that lay along critical hyperspace routes fell first, not through prolonged siege but through overwhelming, decisive strikes that shattered resistance in hours rather than days. Trade corridors that had once been lifelines of the Republic became silent voids, patrolled by massive Zentradi warships whose mere presence deterred any attempt at passage. Entire sectors were effectively cut off, isolated not just physically, but strategically, forcing both the Republic and Separatists into fragmented responses rather than unified action. For the Jedi, this presented a challenge unlike anything they had encountered. Their strength had always been rooted in foresight, adaptability, and their connection to the Force, but the Zentradi war machine operated on principles that did not align with the rhythms of the Force. There was no malice in their advance, no anger or fear to sense, only purpose. It made their movements difficult to anticipate, their intentions opaque even to the most attuned Jedi masters. Where the Sith cloaked themselves in darkness and deception, the Zentradi simply acted, their clarity of purpose becoming its own form of concealment. Obi-Wan Kenobi stood aboard a Republic cruiser overlooking the fragmented remains of a once bustling trade system. The stars themselves seemed dimmer here, obscured by debris and the faint glow of distant fires still burning on shattered worlds. "They don't conquer like we do," he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. "They don't occupy for governance or control. They secure, they fortify, and they move on." Anakin Skywalker, standing nearby, folded his arms as he watched a formation of Zentradi ships drift into position near a hyperspace junction. "Then they're not trying to rule," he replied. "They're preparing for something bigger." That realization spread quickly through Republic Command. The Zentradi were not simply invading, they were establishing a network, a framework for sustained operations on a galactic scale. Each captured system became a node, each fortified world a stepping stone for further expansion. Their efficiency bordered on the mechanical, yet it was driven by living minds, each unit capable of independent action within the boundaries of their command structure. The Republic's response began to evolve. No longer could they rely on holding territory through static defenses. Such positions were easily overwhelmed by Zentradi firepower. Instead, they shifted toward mobile engagements, striking at supply lines, probing for weaknesses, and retreating before the enemy could bring its full might to bear. Clone commanders adapted quickly, their training allowing them to implement new tactics with remarkable speed. Small, highly coordinated units began targeting Zentradi infrastructure, using terrain and timing to their advantage. One such operation unfolded on the industrial world of Braca, where a Zentradi detachment had established a forward staging ground. Clone forces, led by a Jedi Knight, infiltrated the outskirts of the installation under the cover of night. The scale of the structures alone was staggering, hangars large enough to house entire Republic fleets, corridors built to accommodate beings several times the size of a human. The clones moved cautiously, aware that any direct confrontation would likely end in disaster. Their objective was not to destroy the base, but to disrupt it. Charges were placed along critical power conduits, targeting the systems that maintained communication between Zentradi units. When the explosives detonated, the effect was immediate. For a brief moment, the precise coordination that defined the Zentradi faltered. Units hesitated, their movements losing the perfect synchronization that had made them so formidable. It was a small victory, but an important one. It proved that the Zentradi could be disrupted, not defeated outright but unbalanced. However, the response was swift and unforgiving. Zentradi forces adapted within minutes, re-establishing command links and deploying countermeasures that made similar strikes far more difficult. The Republic had gained insight, but at a cost. The clones who carried out the mission barely escaped, their numbers reduced, their losses a stark reminder that every advantage came with a price. Meanwhile, the Separatists began testing their own strategies against the Zentradi. General Grievous led a strike force into a contested system, his fleet emerging from hyperspace with the intent of engaging a Zentradi patrol group. Unlike the Republic, the Separatists relied heavily on overwhelming numbers, their droid armies designed to outlast and outproduce any opponent. Against the Zentradi, this approach yielded mixed results. The initial clash was brutal. Droid fighters swarmed Zentradi vessels, their sheer numbers creating momentary pressure. But the Zentradi responded with devastating efficiency. Their targeting systems adapted quickly, prioritizing high-density formations and eliminating entire waves of droids in seconds. Grievous, however, was not deterred. He pressed the attack, seeking to identify patterns in their defenses, probing for any sign of vulnerability. What he discovered was both encouraging and troubling. While the Zentradi were highly effective against massed assaults, they were less efficient when faced with erratic, unpredictable attacks. Grievous exploited this, directing smaller, more agile units to strike from multiple angles, forcing the Zentradi to divide their attention. It was not enough to secure victory, but it demonstrated that even this seemingly unstoppable force had limits. Back on Coruscant, the Jedi Council grappled with the growing complexity of the situation. Reports from across the galaxy painted a grim picture: systems falling, fleets destroyed, and a new enemy that could not be reasoned with in conventional terms. Yet amid the darkness, there were glimmers of possibility. The brief hesitation observed on Kalarba, the disruption achieved on Braca. These moments suggested that the Zentradi were not entirely beyond understanding. Mace Windu leaned forward, his expression resolute. "We must adapt as they do. This is not a war we can win through strength alone." Yoda nodded slowly. "Learn we must. Evolve we must. Or lost the galaxy will be." As strategies shifted and battles intensified, the true scale of the conflict began to reveal itself. The Zentradi were not simply another faction in the Clone Wars. They were a force that redefined the war entirely. Their presence forced both the Republic and Separatists to confront their own limitations, to rethink doctrines that had guided them for generations. And yet, even as the galaxy struggled to adapt, the Zentradi continued their advance, methodical and unrelenting. Each system they secured brought them closer to the core worlds, closer to the heart of the Republic itself. The question was no longer whether they could be stopped, but whether the galaxy could change fast enough to survive what was coming. The first true attempt at communication did not come from diplomats, senators, or even the Jedi Council. It came from necessity, forged in the chaos of a battlefield where neither side could fully understand the other. On the contested world of Brental 4, a vital trade hub now fractured by Zentradi occupation, a Republic reconnaissance team found itself trapped behind enemy lines after a failed extraction. With communications jammed and escape routes cut off, survival depended on something no clone trooper had ever been trained for: reaching an understanding with an enemy that had never needed one. The team was led by Jedi Knight Avarice Ven, a Mirialan whose connection to the Force was deeply intuitive, more attuned to emotion than strategy. She had felt it before, on Kalarba, in fragmented reports from other Jedi, a strange absence where something should have been. The Zentradi did not resonate in the Force the way other beings did. They were present, undeniably alive, but their emotional imprint was muted, constrained, as though something within them had been deliberately suppressed. Now, as her team moved cautiously through the ruins of a Zentradi-controlled district, that absence became impossible to ignore. Massive structures loomed overhead, their surfaces scarred by battle but already undergoing rapid reconstruction. Patrols moved in rigid formations, each step synchronized with an almost mechanical precision. The air carried the scent of ionized metal and scorched stone, punctuated by the distant hum of energy systems far larger than anything the Republic fielded. "General, we're not going to outfight this," one of the clones muttered, his voice low but tense. "We're not here to fight," Avarice replied, though even she was not entirely certain what they were here to do. Their opportunity came unexpectedly. A small Zentradi unit, 4 soldiers, separated from their main force, entered the same sector, their movements slightly less synchronized than those of larger formations. Perhaps they had lost contact with their command structure, or perhaps they were operating on localized directives. Either way, they were alone. The clones raised their weapons instinctively, but Avarice lifted a hand, stopping them. "Wait!" The Zentradi noticed them almost immediately. Massive weapons were raised, targeting systems locking on with lethal intent. For a moment, time seemed to slow, the air thick with the inevitability of violence. Then Avarice stepped forward, deactivating her lightsaber and lowering it to her side. The reaction was immediate, but not what anyone expected. The Zentradi hesitated. Not for long, not in any way that would be obvious to an untrained eye, but it was there. A fraction of a second where the perfect synchronization faltered. Their weapons remained trained on her, but they did not fire. Avarice closed her eyes briefly, reaching out through the Force, not to dominate or influence, but simply to connect. What she found was unlike anything she had ever encountered. The Zentradi minds were structured, layered with directives and conditioning so deeply ingrained that they bordered on instinct. Yet beneath that structure, there was something else, something faint, buried, but undeniably present. Curiosity. It was not strong, not yet, but it was there, flickering like a distant signal struggling to break through interference. Slowly, carefully, Avarice raised her hands, palms open in a universal gesture of non-aggression. "We don't have to fight," she said, her voice calm, steady, carrying through the open air. The words meant nothing to the Zentradi, at least not linguistically. But communication is not limited to language. Tone, posture, intent. These things transcend translation. For a moment, the soldiers remained frozen, caught between their programming and something they could not fully process. Then one of them took a step forward. It was a small movement, but it broke the symmetry of the group. The other three adjusted slightly, their formation no longer perfectly aligned. The lead Zentradi lowered its weapon, not completely, but enough to signal a shift. Behind Avarice, the clones exchanged uneasy glances. "General, what are they doing?" "I think," she said quietly, "they're trying to understand." The moment was fragile, balanced on a knife's edge. Any sudden movement, any sign of aggression, could shatter it instantly. Avarice took another step forward, her connection to the Force deepening as she focused on that faint spark within the Zentradi mind. It was difficult, like trying to hear a whisper in the middle of a storm, but it was there. Images flickered, fragmented, incomplete. Vast fleets. Endless battles. Orders given and followed without question. A life defined entirely by war, with no concept of anything beyond it. No art, no culture, no individuality, only function. And yet, within that function, a question had begun to form. The Zentradi tilted its head slightly, an almost imperceptible gesture that carried an unexpected weight. It was not confusion, not exactly. It was consideration. Then, abruptly, the moment ended. Signal, sharp, intrusive, cut through the air. The Zentradi stiffened, their postures snapping back into rigid alignment. Weapons were raised once more, their hesitation erased as quickly as it had appeared. Whatever connection Avarice had established was severed, overridden by a higher command. "Fall back," she shouted, igniting her lightsaber as blaster fire erupted around them. The clones responded instantly, forming a defensive perimeter as they retreated through the ruins. The brief window of understanding had closed, replaced once again by the brutal reality of war. Yet something had changed. The encounter, however fleeting, had proven that the Zentradi were not entirely beyond reach. Elsewhere, similar events began to unfold. Reports emerged of Zentradi units exhibiting minor deviations in behavior, hesitations, irregular movements, even instances of non-lethal engagement where lethal force would have been expected. These anomalies were rare, often corrected quickly by their command structure, but they were enough to raise questions among those who studied them. The separatists, ever pragmatic, viewed these developments as potential weaknesses to exploit. Count Dooku, analyzing the data, saw an opportunity not just for tactical advantage, but for something far more significant. If their control can be disrupted, he mused, then they can be reshaped. General Grievous, less interested in subtlety, simply saw new ways to break them. "Then we find the source of that control," he rasped, "and we destroy it." In the shadows, Darth Sidious considered the implications with far greater depth. The Zentradi represented more than just a new enemy. They were a variable that could be manipulated, their rigid structure both a strength and a vulnerability. If their command hierarchy could be influenced, even partially, they could become a weapon unlike any the galaxy had ever seen. But such manipulation would require precision, patience, and an understanding of their nature that few possessed. Back on Brental 4, Avarice Ven and her team finally reached a temporary extraction point, their escape hard-fought but successful. As the transport lifted off, leaving the scarred surface behind, she remained silent, her thoughts fixed on the encounter. They hesitated, one of the clones said, still struggling to process what they had witnessed. "Yes, Avarice replied softly. Why? She looked out at the stars, her expression thoughtful, almost troubled. Because for the first time, she said, they were given a choice. The Clone Wars had always been a conflict of ideology as much as it was of power. But now, with the arrival of the Zentraedi, a new dimension had been introduced, one that challenged the very nature of free will itself. And as the galaxy continued to burn, that question, whether beings created solely for war could ever become something more, began to echo far beyond the battlefield. The war did not slow, it transformed. What had once been a chaotic three-sided conflict began to evolve into something far more unstable, shaped not just by firepower and strategy, but by the growing realization that the Zentraedi were not as unchangeable as they first appeared. Across multiple systems, small inconsistencies began to surface in their otherwise flawless execution. Units hesitated for fractions of seconds. Patrol routes deviated slightly from established patterns. Engagements that should have ended in total annihilation instead left survivors behind. Individually, these anomalies meant little. Together, they formed the outline of a shift that no one could yet fully explain. The Republic High Command initially treated these reports as errors, misinterpretations from exhausted troops or glitches in battlefield data. But the Jedi knew better. The Force, though still strangely muted around the Zentraedi, had begun to ripple in subtle, unfamiliar ways whenever these moments occurred. It was not the clear, luminous presence they sensed in other living beings, but it was no longer entirely silent either. Something was changing beneath the surface, something that could not be reduced to tactics or programming. Anakin Skywalker felt it more strongly than most. On the war-torn world of Dantooine, where Zentraedi forces had begun converting vast plains into fortified staging zones, he led a strike team deep into enemy territory. The mission was straightforward: disable a central command relay that coordinated local Zentraedi movements. But what he encountered there was anything but simple. The facility itself was immense, its architecture built on a scale that dwarfed even Republic installations. Inside, the hum of energy systems reverberated through every surface, a constant reminder of the power sustaining the Zentraedi war machine. Clone troopers moved carefully, planting charges and securing corridors, while Anakin pressed forward, guided less by strategy and more by instinct. That instinct led him to a chamber unlike any he had seen before. At its center stood a single Zentraedi, connected to an array of systems that pulsed with synchronized light. It was not a commander in the traditional sense, but something closer to a node, a living extension of the command network itself. The Zentraedi turned as Anakin entered, its massive form shifting with deliberate precision. Its weapon remained lowered, but there was no mistaking the tension in its posture. For a moment, neither moved. Then Anakin did something unexpected. He deactivated his lightsaber. "You don't have to do this," he said, his voice steady, though the words were as much for himself as they were for the being before him. The Zentraedi did not respond, not verbally. But something happened. The pulsing lights connected to its form flickered, their rhythm disrupted. Anakin felt it then clearer than ever before, not just the faint spark Avarice had described, but something stronger, struggling against the weight of its own design. Images flooded his mind, not through words, but through sensation. Endless training. Endless battle. A life defined entirely by orders given and followed without question. But beneath that, something new had begun to form, an awareness of those orders, a recognition that they were not inherent truths, but imposed directives. "You're not just a weapon," Anakin said quietly. "You can choose." For a brief, fragile moment, the connection deepened. The Zentraedi's stance shifted, its rigid posture softening ever so slightly. The lights around it dimmed, their synchronization breaking apart as if the system itself were losing its grip. Then the alarms began. The facility reacted instantly to the disruption. Systems surged, attempting to reassert control. The Zentraedi convulsed, its body tensing as conflicting signals tore through its neural pathways. The moment of clarity collapsed under the weight of enforced command. Its weapons snapped upward, targeting Anakin with lethal precision. Anakin ignited his lightsaber just as the blast fired, deflecting the energy with a sharp, controlled motion. The connection was gone, replaced by the cold efficiency that defined the Zentradi once more. "General, charges are set," a clone trooper called out over the comm. "We need to move." Anakin hesitated for only a second before turning away. There was nothing more he could do here, not now. As the team evacuated and the facility erupted in a cascade of explosions, he couldn't shake the feeling that something important had just slipped through his grasp. The destruction of the relay achieved its immediate objective. Zentradi forces across Dantooine faltered briefly, their coordination disrupted long enough for Republic forces to reclaim key positions. But the victory was temporary. Within hours, the network re-established itself, stronger and more resilient than before. The Zentradi adapted as they always did. Yet the encounter left a lasting impact, not just on Anakin, but on the broader understanding of the war. The idea that the Zentradi could be reached, even momentarily, began to spread through the Jedi ranks. It was no longer a question of whether they were capable of change, but how that change could be sustained. The Separatists, observing these developments through their own intelligence networks, reached a different conclusion. If the Zentradi could be influenced, then they could be controlled. Count Dooku began experimenting with ways to interfere with their command structure, using advanced signal disruption and targeted strikes against their network nodes. The results were inconsistent, but promising enough to warrant further effort. General Grievous, ever the pragmatist, saw a more direct approach. "If their control is centralized," he growled, "then we sever the head." His campaigns shifted toward targeting the largest Zentradi command vessels, engaging them with overwhelming force in an attempt to collapse their hierarchy. These efforts met with mixed success. While some Zentradi formations did exhibit disarray when their command ships were destroyed, others adapted quickly, redistributing control among remaining units. It became clear that their structure, while hierarchical, was also redundant, designed to survive precisely this kind of disruption. Across the galaxy, the war escalated. Entire systems became battlegrounds not just for territory, but for understanding. The Republic sought to exploit the growing cracks in the Zentradi's unity. The Separatists sought to weaponize them. And the Zentradi themselves continued their advance, seemingly unaffected by the deeper implications of what was happening within their ranks. But beneath that relentless progression, something undeniable was taking shape. Each moment of hesitation, each deviation from perfect synchronization, was a step, small, fragile, but real, toward something the Zentradi had never been meant to experience. Individuality. It was not widespread, not yet. Most Zentradi remained firmly within the bounds of their conditioning, their actions dictated by the unyielding logic of their design. But the seeds had been planted, and in a galaxy as vast and dynamic as this one, even the smallest change could grow into something far greater. Anakin stood aboard a Republic cruiser days later, staring out at the stars as reports continued to pour in. Systems falling. Fleets clashing. An enemy that could not be stopped through conventional means. "They're changing," he said quietly, almost to himself. Obi-Wan, standing nearby, regarded him with a thoughtful expression. "Perhaps," he replied. "But change does not always lead where we expect." Anakin didn't respond immediately. His thoughts were elsewhere, on that brief moment in the chamber, on the feeling of something reaching back before it was forced into silence. "If they can change," he said finally, "then this war doesn't have to end the way everyone thinks it will." Obi-Wan considered that, his gaze shifting to the distant stars. "Let us hope," he said softly, "that we are not too late to find out." The war continued to burn across the galaxy, but it was no longer defined solely by destruction. Beneath the surface, unseen by most, a different kind of battle had begun, one not of fleets and armies, but of identity, choice, and the possibility of something new emerging from the heart of a force that had only ever known war. The fractures within the Zentradi war machine did not spread like a wildfire. They spread like pressure cracks in reinforced glass, slow, subtle, almost invisible at first, but carrying the potential to shatter everything when the strain became too great. Across multiple sectors, Republic intelligence began identifying a pattern. The anomalies were no longer isolated incidents tied to Jedi proximity or battlefield chaos. They were appearing independently, in regions where no Force-sensitive influence had been recorded, in units operating far from any known disruption points. This changed everything. Until now, the working theory within both Republic and Separatist command had been that the Zentradi deviations were external reactions, responses to Jedi influence, signal interference, or environmental variables. But if these changes were occurring spontaneously, then the implication was far more profound. It meant the Zentradi were not simply being affected by the galaxy. They were beginning to evolve within it. On the core-adjacent world of Anaxes, one of the Republic's most fortified military hubs, the implications of that evolution became impossible to ignore. A Zentradi assault force emerged from hyperspace without warning, its formation tighter and more coordinated than any previously encountered. Republic defenses activated immediately, orbital cannons firing in synchronized volleys, fighter squadrons launching in waves, but something about this attack was different. The Zentradi did not advance in their usual overwhelming formation. Instead, they divided, splitting into smaller, highly adaptive units that maneuvered with a level of unpredictability that mirrored Republic tactics. They avoided concentrated fire zones, exploited defensive gaps, and targeted critical infrastructure with surgical precision. It was as if they had learned, not just from observation, but from experience. Inside the command center, clone officers worked frantically to adjust their response. "They're adapting in real time," one of them reported, his voice tight with urgency. "They're not following previous engagement patterns." Mace Windu stood at the center of the room, his expression unreadable but his focus absolute. "They are no longer simply executing strategy," he said. "They are creating it." That realization spread quickly through the Republic's leadership. The Zentradi were no longer just a superior military force. They were becoming something far more dangerous. A force capable of growth, of innovation, of learning not just how to fight, but how to think. The battle for Anaxes was brutal. Republic forces held, but barely, their defenses strained to the breaking point by an enemy that no longer behaved predictably. When the Zentradi finally withdrew, it was not in defeat, but in calculated retreat, pulling back at the exact moment their objective had been achieved. Key installations had been destroyed, supply chains disrupted, and the Republic's confidence shaken. Elsewhere, similar transformations were unfolding. On Separatist-controlled worlds, Zentradi forces began countering droid strategies with increasing effectiveness, exploiting the rigid programming of battle droids in ways that mirrored the very weaknesses the Republic had long taken advantage of. General Grievous, observing these engagements, found himself facing an opponent that was beginning to reflect his own adaptability. "They learn," he snarled, watching as a Zentradi unit anticipated and countered a flanking maneuver he had used countless times before. "Then we will teach them fear." But fear was not something the Zentradi understood, not in the way organic beings did. Their evolution was not driven by emotion, but by necessity. Each engagement, each encounter, added to a growing body of experience that reshaped their approach to warfare. They were no longer just executing a mission. They were refining it. In the shadows, Darth Sidious watched these developments with growing interest and caution. The Zentradi had initially presented themselves as a potential tool, a force that could be manipulated and directed to serve his ultimate design. But tools that evolve are no longer tools. They become variables, and variables introduce risk. For the first time, Sidious began to consider the possibility that the Zentradi might not be controllable at all. That their growing independence could place them beyond even his influence. This was unacceptable. His attention turned toward the one element that had consistently disrupted the Zentradi's control structure, the Force. Specifically, the unique way in which certain individuals, Anakin Skywalker among them, had been able to create moments of instability within their network. If that effect could be amplified, refined, and directed, it might be possible to do more than disrupt the Zentradi. It might be possible to dominate them. Meanwhile, the Jedi pursued a very different path. On a secluded world deep in the Mid-Rim, a group of Jedi scholars and researchers began studying the Zentradi anomalies in depth. Rather than focusing on how to defeat them, they sought to understand the underlying cause of their transformation. What they discovered challenged everything they thought they knew about the nature of life and the Force. The Zentradi, it seemed, had been designed to suppress individuality, to function as a unified whole, each unit an extension of a larger command structure. But that suppression was not absolute. It was maintained through constant reinforcement, through signals and systems that kept their thoughts aligned and their actions synchronized. Remove or disrupt those systems, even briefly, and something remarkable happened. The individual mind began to surface. It was not fully formed, not at first. More like a fragment, a glimpse of what could be rather than what was. But with each disruption, each moment of independence, that fragment grew stronger. They are not becoming something new, one of the Jedi researchers concluded. They are becoming what they were always capable of being. This insight spread quietly through the Jedi Order, influencing their approach to the war. Rather than seeking to destroy the Zentradi outright, some began exploring ways to amplify these moments of individuality, to create conditions where the Zentradi could break free from their conditioning on a larger scale. It was a dangerous idea, one that could just as easily backfire as succeed. But in a war where conventional victory seemed increasingly unlikely, it offered a different kind of hope. Anakin, hearing of these efforts, found himself drawn to them. The memory of his encounter on Dantooine still lingered, the sense of connection that had been cut short but not forgotten. He began to see the Zentradi not just as enemies, but as something more complex, beings caught between what they were and what they could become. Obi-Wan, ever cautious, warned him against placing too much faith in that possibility. "We must not lose sight of what they are doing," he said. "Whatever they may become, they are still a threat to the galaxy as it stands." Anakin understood that. He saw the destruction, the countless lives lost, the systems reduced to ruin. But he also saw something else, a chance, however small, to change the outcome of the war in a way that did not end in total annihilation. As the conflict escalated, the galaxy found itself at a crossroads. The Zentradi continued to advance, stronger and more adaptive with each passing engagement. The Republic and Separatists struggled to keep pace, their strategies evolving but never quite enough to regain control. And beneath it all, an invisible shift continued to grow. The Zentradi were changing, not as a unified force, but as individuals beginning to emerge from within that force. Each moment of independence, each deviation from perfect synchronization, was a step toward something that had never existed within their ranks before. It was still fragile, still rare, but it was there. And as it spread, it carried with it the potential to reshape not just the Zentradi, but the entire course of the war. Because a force that could choose was no longer predictable. And in a galaxy built on the balance between order and chaos, unpredictability was the one thing that could change everything. The shift from anomaly to awakening did not announce itself with a single event. There was no defining moment where the Zentradi suddenly became something new. Instead, it unfolded in layers, quiet, uneven, and deeply unsettling for every power in the galaxy. What had once been rare deviations began to cluster, then spread, then echo across entirely separate battlefronts. Patterns emerged where there should have been none. Units that had never encountered Jedi, never experienced signal disruption, never been isolated from their command hierarchy began to behave differently. Not erratically, not chaotically, independently. The first undeniable confirmation came from a conflict zone near the outer rim world of Salakami. Republic forces, locked in a prolonged engagement with both separatist droids and advancing Zentradi formations, reported something unprecedented. A Zentradi battalion had disengaged mid-conflict, not retreating, not repositioning, but ceasing hostilities altogether. They moved away from the battlefield, ignoring both Republic and Separatist forces, and established a perimeter in a neutral zone between the warring sides. At first, it was assumed to be a tactical maneuver, a regrouping strategy. But as hours passed, then days, it became clear that something else was happening. The Zentradi were not preparing for another assault. They were holding position, observing, Republic reconnaissance teams watched from a distance, uncertain whether they were witnessing a trap or something far more significant. No attacks came. No reinforcements arrived. The Zentradi simply remained, their formation loose, their movements no longer perfectly synchronized. When a small scouting unit approached, carefully, cautiously, the Zentradi did not respond with immediate aggression. Weapons were raised but not fired. There was hesitation. Not the fleeting, suppressed hesitation seen in earlier encounters, but something sustained, deliberate. Word of the incident spread rapidly, reaching both the Jedi Council and the highest levels of Republic command. Similar reports began to surface from other regions. Isolated units breaking formation. Patrols deviating from orders. Entire groups pausing in the midst of operations as if awaiting instructions that never came, or choosing not to follow the ones they received. The Zentradi were no longer a singular will. They were becoming many. This realization sent shockwaves through the galaxy. For the Republic, it presented both an opportunity and a profound uncertainty. If the Zentradi could be reasoned with, even partially, then the war might not be unwinnable. But if their fragmentation led to unpredictability on a massive scale, it could make the conflict even more dangerous. The Separatists reacted with far less hesitation. Count Dooku saw the fractures not as a sign of hope, but as a vulnerability to exploit. He ordered immediate strikes against isolated Zentradi groups, seeking to eliminate them before their independence could solidify into something more organized. To him, this was a window, a brief moment where the Zentradi were neither fully unified nor fully autonomous, and therefore at their weakest. General Grievous carried out those orders with brutal efficiency. On multiple fronts, Separatist forces targeted deviating Zentradi units, overwhelming them with concentrated firepower. Some were destroyed. Others fought back with a ferocity that suggested their newfound independence did not equate to passivity. But in several cases, something unexpected occurred. The Zentradi did not always respond with violence. In one engagement, a Separatist assault force encountered a fragmented Zentradi group that had taken refuge within the ruins of a former Republic outpost. As droid forces advanced, preparing to eradicate them, the Zentradi did something no one had ever recorded before. They attempted to communicate, not through language, not through any established system, but through action. They powered down their primary weapons. They stepped back, creating distance. They did not attack, even as the droids closed in. The droids, following their programming, opened fire. The result was swift and devastating. But the data from that encounter, transmitted back to Separatist command, forced even Dooku to reconsider. The Zentradi were not simply breaking away from control. They were experimenting, in their own limited way, with alternatives to it. For the Jedi, this confirmed what some had already begun to believe. The Zentradi were not just evolving tactically. They were undergoing something far more profound. A transition from imposed existence to self-directed being. On Coruscant, the Jedi Council convened in urgent session. The implications of this shift could not be ignored. If the Zentradi continued on this path, the war would no longer be defined by opposing sides, but by a fundamental transformation of one of those sides into something entirely new. Mace Windu spoke first, his tone measured but firm. We are witnessing the emergence of individuality within a force designed to suppress it. This is not a tactical development. It is a philosophical one. Yoda, his expression contemplative, nodded slowly. Change they are. Becoming something else, they may be. But dangerous still. The question before them was not whether the Zentradi could be stopped. It was whether they should be treated as enemies in the same way as before. Anakin, present for the discussion, did not hesitate. If they can choose, then they're not just an army anymore, he said. They're people. Maybe not like us, not yet, but they're becoming something closer to that every time they break away. Obi-Wan regarded him carefully. And what would you have us do? Give them a reason to keep choosing, Anakin replied. Not just fighting. Not just following orders. Something else. It was a radical idea. One that challenged the very nature of the war itself. But as more reports came in, of Zentradi units disengaging, observing, even avoiding unnecessary conflict, it became harder to dismiss. Meanwhile, in the shadows of the galaxy, Darth Sidious watched this evolution with growing displeasure. The Zentradi were slipping beyond the bounds of predictability, their fragmentation making them increasingly difficult to manipulate. A unified force could be controlled, redirected, used as a weapon. A fragmented one, driven by emerging individuality, could not. This was not part of his design. His plans relied on certainty, on control, on the ability to shape events toward a singular outcome. The Zentradi, in their current state, threatened all of that. They introduced variables that could not be easily accounted for, decisions made not by command, but by choice. And choice, in the hands of beings who had never possessed it before, was inherently unstable. Sidious began to consider more direct intervention. If the Zentradi could not be controlled as a whole, then perhaps they could be reshaped at their core, forced into a new form of unity, one that served his purposes rather than undermined them. But such an effort would require careful timing. Acting too soon could accelerate their fragmentation. Acting too late could render them completely beyond his reach. Across the galaxy, the war continued, but its nature had fundamentally changed. It was no longer just a clash of armies, but a collision of identities, of what the Zentradi had been, what they were becoming, and what the rest of the galaxy would allow them to become. On Salakami, the isolated battalion still held its position. Republic forces, after days of observation, made a decision. A small delegation, led by a Jedi, approached the perimeter, not with weapons raised, but with cautious intent. This time, when the Zentradi reacted, the hesitation did not vanish. It remained, and for the first time, it was not overridden. The distance between them, once defined entirely by war, narrowed, not through force, but through something far more uncertain. Understanding. What began as hesitation became presence, and presence began to reshape the battlefield in ways no strategist, Republic or Separatist, had ever prepared for. The Zentradi were no longer advancing as a single, unstoppable tide. They were fragmenting into clusters of intent, each group acting with a degree of independence that defied every model of war the galaxy had relied on. Some continued their campaigns with ruthless efficiency, pressing into systems and dismantling defenses with terrifying precision. Others slowed, diverted, or withdrew entirely, creating pockets of stillness in regions that had once been consumed by constant conflict. These pockets became something new. At first, they were treated as anomalies, temporary pauses in a larger storm. But as they multiplied, it became clear they were not accidents. They were choices. On the mid-rim world of Ord Mantell, one such zone drew the attention of both Republic and Separatist observers. A significant Zentradi force had taken control of a major industrial sector early in the conflict, converting its infrastructure to support their operations. Weeks later, reports indicated that activity within the zone had changed. Energy output dropped. Patrol patterns loosened. Engagements with local resistance ceased altogether. When reconnaissance teams moved in, what they found challenged every assumption they had made about the enemy. The Zentradi were still there, still armed, still capable, but they were no longer operating as an occupying force. They had stopped expanding their control. They had stopped attacking. Instead, they appeared to be maintaining. Structures damaged in earlier fighting were being stabilized rather than repurposed. Environmental systems were being recalibrated to restore balance rather than maximize output. It was not reconstruction in the traditional sense, but it was not destruction either. It was something in between, a state of suspension, as if the Zentradi themselves were uncertain what their purpose should be now that they were no longer bound entirely by it. Republic Command debated immediate intervention. A weakened enemy position was an opportunity, one that could not be ignored in a war of this scale. But the Jedi advised caution. If we strike without understanding what we are seeing, Obi-Wan argued, we risk turning something unprecedented into something familiar. Another battle. Another cycle. Anakin, reviewing the reports, felt that same pull he had experienced before, not toward combat, but toward the possibility that something within the Zentradi was reaching outward, searching for direction. They're not just stopping, he said. They're trying to figure out what comes next. The decision was made to observe rather than engage. For the first time in the war, a Zentradi-held region was left unchallenged, not out of fear, but out of uncertainty. The Separatists, however, did not share that hesitation. To them, any deviation from optimal function was a weakness to be exploited. A strike force was dispatched to Ord Mantell with orders to eliminate the Zentradi presence before it could stabilize into something more coherent. The attack was swift and calculated. Droid units advanced in overwhelming numbers, targeting key positions within the zone. Under any previous circumstances, the Zentradi response would have been immediate and decisive, overwhelming force, precise coordination, total annihilation of the attackers. This time, it was different. Some Zentradi units responded as expected, mobilizing to defend their position with lethal efficiency. Others did not. They held back, repositioned, or withdrew entirely, creating gaps in what should have been an impenetrable defense. The result was not a coordinated resistance, but a fractured one, multiple responses occurring simultaneously, each driven by a different interpretation of the situation. The battle that followed was chaotic in a way that no one had anticipated. Not because of randomness, but because of divergence. The Zentradi were no longer acting as one. They were acting as many, each unit making its own decision about what the conflict required. Some chose to fight. Some chose to protect. And some chose not to engage at all. Republic observers watched from orbit, unable to fully comprehend what they were witnessing. This was not a breakdown of command. It was the emergence of will. The Separatist assault ultimately succeeded in destabilizing the zone, but not in the way it had intended. The Zentradi presence did not collapse, it scattered. Units disengaged, retreating in multiple directions, some rejoining the larger Zentradi forces, others disappearing into the wider galaxy. The industrial sector itself was left in a state of partial ruin, its brief moment of stillness erased by renewed conflict. But the impact of what had occurred could not be undone. The data, the recordings, the first-hand accounts, they all pointed to the same conclusion. The Zentradi were no longer defined by a single purpose. They were beginning to define themselves. This realization forced a shift in how the war was perceived at every level. The Republic could no longer treat the Zentradi solely as an invading force. The Separatists could no longer rely on predictable patterns of behavior. And the Jedi, perhaps more than anyone, were forced to confront the deeper implications of what was unfolding. The Force itself seemed to respond to this change. Where once the Zentradi had existed as a void, an absence that disrupted perception, they now registered as something more complex. Not fully present, not fully integrated, but no longer invisible. Faint impressions began to surface, flickers of awareness that varied from one unit to another. Some remained as silent as before, others did not. On a remote outpost along the edge of the Outer Rim, a Jedi Knight encountered one of these altered Zentradi alone. There was no battle, no immediate threat. The Zentradi stood at a distance, its posture uncertain, its weapon lowered but not discarded. The Knight reached out through the Force, expecting the familiar resistance, the emptiness that had defined every previous encounter. Instead, there was something else. Faint, unsteady, but unmistakably there. Not just presence. Confusion. The connection lasted only seconds before it faded, the Zentradi turning away and disappearing into the barren landscape. But it was enough. Proof that the change was not just external, not just behavioral, but internal. The Zentradi were beginning to feel. That development carried implications far beyond the battlefield. Emotion, uncertainty, curiosity, even the earliest traces of empathy, introduced variables that could not be easily predicted or controlled. It also introduced the possibility of conflict within the Zentradi themselves. Not all would change at the same rate. Not all would choose the same path. Some would cling to the clarity of their original purpose, resisting the fragmentation as a threat to their existence. Others would embrace the emerging sense of self, seeking to understand it, to expand it, to define it on their own terms. The Zentradi were no longer just an external force acting upon the galaxy. They were becoming a part of it, subject to the same complexities, the same contradictions, the same capacity for both creation and destruction. And as that transformation accelerated, the war itself began to lose its original shape. It was no longer simply about victory or defeat, about territory or dominance. It was about what the Zentradi would become, and how the rest of the galaxy would respond to that becoming. Because if an army designed for endless war could learn to question its purpose, then the outcome of this conflict would not be decided solely by who was stronger. It would be decided by who understood what was happening and who adapted to it first. The war reached a point where scale no longer defined it. Entire fleets could clash across star systems, planets could fall in hours, and yet those events began to feel like surface ripples compared to the deeper transformation unfolding beneath them. The Zentradi were no longer just participating in the conflict, they were redefining its nature at the most fundamental level. Where once there had been clarity, republic versus separatist, order versus rebellion, strategy versus counterstrategy, there was now a third dimension layered over everything. Not an alliance, not a faction, but a state of becoming that neither side fully understood and neither could fully control. This uncertainty reached its peak in a region that had, until recently, held little strategic significance. A cluster of systems along the mid-rim trade corridor, previously contested only for supply routes, suddenly became the center of attention for all three powers. Not because of resources or position, but because of what had begun to emerge there. Multiple Zentradi groups, fractured, independent, and evolving at different rates, had converged within the region. But instead of clashing or merging into a single unified force, they formed something far more complex. Distinct clusters, each operating under its own internal logic, its own interpretation of purpose. Some maintained rigid coordination, preserving the original structure of the Zentradi command. Others exhibited looser organization, adapting fluidly to changing conditions. And a few had abandoned conventional patterns entirely, moving unpredictably, interacting with their environment in ways that defied military classification. It was not an army. It was an ecosystem. Republic observers, analyzing the situation, struggled to categorize what they were seeing. They're not consolidating, one strategist noted. They're coexisting. Competing, maybe, but not in a way that leads to a single outcome. The Jedi felt something even more profound. The Force, which had once recoiled from the Zentradi presence, now reacted with a strange duality. Some clusters still felt like voids, cold, distant, resistant to perception. Others flickered with something new, something unstable but growing stronger with each passing moment. And in rare instances, there were points of clarity, brief, fragile alignments where the Zentradi presence resonated faintly within the Force, as if testing its place within it. Anakin was among those sent to observe the region firsthand. From orbit, he could see the patterns forming, movements that were not random, but not entirely structured either. It reminded him of something he couldn't quite place, something between instinct and intention. "They're deciding," he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. Obi-Wan, standing beside him, followed his gaze. Deciding what? Anakin didn't answer immediately. Because the truth was he didn't know. And that uncertainty was what made the situation so dangerous. The Separatists, unwilling to allow such a variable to exist unchecked, moved first. A massive fleet, led by General Grievous, entered the region with orders to eliminate all Zentradi presence and reassert control over the corridor. The strategy was straightforward, overwhelming force applied across multiple points simultaneously, preventing the Zentradi clusters from coordinating or adapting effectively. Under normal circumstances, it would have worked. But nothing about this situation was normal. As the Separatist fleet advanced, the Zentradi did not respond as a unified force. Each cluster reacted differently. Some engaged directly, meeting the assault with the same overwhelming aggression that had defined their earlier campaigns. Others withdrew, avoiding confrontation entirely. And a few did something no one had anticipated: they moved toward each other. Not to merge, to interact. Republic sensors picked up the movements immediately. Zentradi groups that had previously operated in isolation were now converging, their formations shifting in ways that suggested coordination, but not of the traditional kind. It was not a command structure reasserting itself. It was something more fluid, more dynamic. They're sharing, one analyst suggested, though the word felt inadequate. Data, experience, perspective. Whatever it was, it allowed them to respond to the separatist assault with a level of adaptability that exceeded anything seen before. Strategies that had worked against one cluster failed against another. Tactics that forced retreat in one engagement were countered and reversed in the next. The Zentradi were no longer just learning individually, they were learning collectively, without losing their individuality. The battle that followed was unlike anything recorded in the war. It was not a single engagement, but a series of overlapping conflicts, each shaped by the unique behavior of the Zentradi groups involved. Grievous found himself facing an enemy that could not be predicted, could not be contained, and could not be forced into a single pattern of response. For the first time, the separatist offensive stalled. Not because the Zentradi were stronger in a conventional sense, but because they were no longer constrained by convention at all. The Republic, observing from the edges of the conflict, faced a critical decision. To intervene would mean entering a battle where the rules were no longer clear, where allies and enemies could not be easily distinguished. To hold back would mean allowing the situation to evolve without influence, risking outcomes that could not be controlled. The Jedi Council chose restraint. "This is not a battle we understand," Mace Windu stated. "To act without understanding is to risk making it worse." Anakin disagreed. Not openly, not immediately, but the tension was there. Because what he saw in the Zentradi was not just danger, but potential. A chance for something different, something that could break the endless cycle of war rather than perpetuate it. As the conflict in the corridor intensified, a new development began to emerge, one that would shift the balance yet again. Within one of the more advanced Zentradi clusters, a form of internal cohesion began to take shape. Not a return to centralized command, but a voluntary alignment. A group of units choosing to act together, not because they were forced to, but because they had decided to. Their movements became more precise, their responses more coordinated, but without the rigidity that had defined their original structure. They were not being controlled. They were cooperating. This distinction, subtle as it was, represented a fundamental shift. It suggested that the Zentradi were not simply breaking free from their past, but building something new in its place. Something that combined the strengths of their original design with the flexibility of their emerging individuality. If that process continued, it would create a force unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Not an army, not a collection of individuals, but a hybrid, capable of unity without losing autonomy, capable of adaptation without sacrificing cohesion. For the Republic, this raised the possibility of coexistence. For the Separatists, it represented an existential threat. And for Darth Sidious, watching from the shadows, it was something far more dangerous than either side realized. Because a force that could choose unity, rather than have it imposed, could not be easily divided. And a force that could not be divided, could not be conquered. As the battle in the corridor reached its peak, the outcome remained uncertain. The Separatist fleet continued its assault, adapting as best it could to the ever-changing Zentradi responses. The Zentradi clusters, in turn, evolved with each passing moment, their interactions growing more complex, more deliberate. And at the center of it all, the question that had begun as a faint possibility now loomed as the defining issue of the war. Not who would win, but what the Zentradi would ultimately become, and whether the galaxy was ready to face the answer. The galaxy seemed to hold its breath. Systems that had barely registered on star charts became central theaters of influence, and every faction, Republic, Separatist, and the Zentradi themselves, was forced to reconsider everything they thought they knew about war, strategy, and survival. The Zentradi had transformed the conflict from a simple contest of armies into an entirely new paradigm, one that challenged conventional notions of power, cohesion, and autonomy. At the forefront of the Republic's observation fleet, Anakin Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi studied the Zentradi movements with growing concern and fascination. They had seen advanced military forces, coordinated separatist fleets, and droid armies capable of tactical precision, but nothing like this. The Zentradi were not just fighting, They were evolving, learning at a pace that far outstripped any known military doctrine. Units that had previously been hostile to each other were now sharing data, experience, and tactical insight in a decentralized network of decision-making that defied human and droid comprehension alike. "They're organizing themselves," Anakin said, his tone a mix of awe and apprehension. "But not the way we understand organization. It's like they've rewritten the rules while we were watching." Obi-Wan nodded gravely. "The danger is that we cannot predict their endgame. The Separatists are faltering because they treat the Zentraedi like a conventional army. And they are anything but conventional." Meanwhile, the Separatist command structure began to crumble under the strain. Count Dooku, observing the events through holorecordings, realized that standard tactics were failing at every turn. The Zentraedi clusters did not respond to intimidation, overwhelming firepower, or coordinated assault in the ways that typical adversaries did. Some units engaged directly with explosive aggression, others withdrew to reform and adapt. Still others appeared to ignore the conflict entirely, moving according to their own internal calculus. "It is as if they are alive in a way we cannot measure," Dooku murmured, his fingers steepled over the projection. "Not merely soldiers, but a collective consciousness evolving beyond command." The Separatists attempted to consolidate their forces, but each move only played into the Zentraedi's adaptive strategies. General Grievous found himself engaged in multiple theaters simultaneously, facing unexpected ambushes and counterattacks that seemed to anticipate his every maneuver. Droid armies that had once functioned as extensions of their programming now struggled to match the fluidity of their adversaries. The Separatist advantage of quantity over quality had become a liability, as sheer numbers could not compensate for the unpredictable coordination of Zentraedi clusters. Amidst this turmoil, the Zentraedi themselves reached a milestone. Across the mid-rim corridor, the separate clusters began to achieve a form of emergent cohesion that was neither centralized nor authoritarian. Individual units chose to align voluntarily, forming temporary alliances that could dissolve and reform as the situation demanded. Combat effectiveness soared, but autonomy was preserved. This new model of warfare, cooperative, adaptive, and self-determined, presented the galaxy with a force that could not be coerced, negotiated with, or easily destroyed. The Republic Council convened an emergency session to determine how to proceed. Mon Mothma, Bail Organa, and other senators expressed concern that unchecked Zentraedi evolution could destabilize the mid-rim entirely. Jedi Masters debated the ethical implications. Should they intervene to impose order, or allow the Zentraedi to define their own path? Mace Windu argued for caution. "We cannot fight what we do not understand. Intervention carries the risk of creating a threat greater than the one we hope to contain." In parallel, Darth Sidious observed the developments with his characteristic patience. Where the Republic and Separatists saw chaos, he recognized opportunity. A force capable of autonomous decision-making and collective evolution could either be a tool for ultimate control or a catastrophic wildcard. His manipulations began subtly, planting misinformation, nudging factions into conflict, and ensuring that no single force could stabilize the situation long enough to harness it fully. Amid this chaos, individual Zentraedi leaders began demonstrating signs of strategic and philosophical awareness. One cluster, led by a commander who had survived countless battles and exhibited rare insight, began to experiment with communication across clusters, facilitating a voluntary network that extended intelligence and tactical decisions without imposing hierarchy. They called this emergent concept the unity of choice. Each unit could act independently, yet contribute to collective success when alignment was advantageous. Anakin Skywalker, watching this development unfold, felt a mixture of awe and unease. The Force responded in ways he had never experienced. Pulses of energy from the Zentraedi aligned unpredictably with light and dark currents, suggesting that the species, while alien, had begun interacting with the galaxy's mystical energy in ways that transcended their biology. There were moments when he could sense decisions being made collectively, a subtle resonance that echoed through the Force. "The galaxy has never faced anything like this," he said, voice low. "They are not Sith, not Jedi, not droids. They are something else entirely. and they are learning faster than we can. The separatist fleets, fragmented and overwhelmed, began a desperate retreat. Grievous ordered scorch system tactics, attempting to deny resources to the Zentradi, but these efforts were largely ineffective. Clusters anticipated the destruction, splitting and reconverging in ways that minimized losses while maximizing disruption. Supply lines were rendered irrelevant, hyperspace choke points were bypassed or neutralized through unpredictable maneuvers. Even the Republic forces, though less pressured, found themselves challenged. Coordinating with local militias, planetary defense systems, and Jedi units was complicated by the Zentradi's dynamic evolution. A battle that could have been anticipated based on prior intelligence often resulted in unexpected outcomes. For every advantage the Republic gained, the Zentradi adapted, countering with efficiency that defied conventional logic. Amid the chaos, some Zentradi began interacting with the galaxy's inhabitants in non-combative ways. They explored local technology, observed planetary ecosystems, and, in rare cases, engaged in limited dialogue with intelligent species. This behavior suggested that while the Zentradi retained their warrior instinct, they were also capable of learning diplomacy, understanding environmental constraints, and recognizing potential allies without coercion. It was a turning point. Where once the galaxy had feared an unstoppable war machine, a new narrative began to emerge, one in which the Zentradi were not merely invaders but agents of transformation. Their presence forced every faction to confront limitations in their understanding of power, adaptation, and survival. By the time the final engagements of the Mid-Rim campaign concluded, it was clear that the Zentradi were no longer a transient threat. They had established a footprint across multiple systems, integrating themselves into the galactic landscape without allegiance to any single faction. Their unity was self-determined, their evolution ongoing. They could fight or withdraw, engage or observe, and they would do so on their own terms. The galaxy itself had changed in response to the Zentradi. Republic and separatist forces were now forced to consider nonlinear strategies, decentralization, and adaptive tactics. Jedi Masters reflected on the Force's responsiveness to the Zentradi, understanding that living systems could interact with the mystical currents in unforeseen ways. Even Darth Sidious, Master Manipulator, recognized that some variables had grown beyond his capacity to control completely. And yet, despite the complexity, there was a sense of balance emerging. The Zentradi did not seek domination in the conventional sense. They did not impose tyranny, nor did they demand allegiance. They were an evolving force, shaping the galaxy as much through presence and choice as through combat. Their philosophy, or the equivalent of one, was clear: survival, adaptation, and the pursuit of self-determined unity. As the dust settled across the Mid-Rim, both Jedi and Senators convened once more to assess the new reality. The Zentradi were no longer an anomaly to be eradicated or controlled. They were a permanent feature of the galaxy, a force whose continued evolution would shape political, military, and mystical landscapes for decades to come. Anakin Skywalker, gazing across the starfield from his command vessel, felt both apprehension and hope. The galaxy had survived countless conflicts, endured empires and rebellions, and weathered the ambitions of both Sith and Jedi alike. But now, something fundamentally new had entered the equation. Something that defied classification, something that could not be controlled, and something that demanded respect. "They're not just soldiers," he said quietly. "They're a new form of life in the galaxy. And if we survive this, the future will never be the same." Obi-Wan, standing beside him, nodded. "We've faced uncertainty before, Anakin. But this is unlike anything we've seen. The challenge now is not just to fight, but to understand." And across the Mid-Rim, the Zentradi continued their evolution. They would test the galaxy, push its limits, and shape its destiny, not as conquerors, but as a force of self-determined emergence, whose influence would ripple across stars, planets, and the Force itself for generations to come. The galaxy had changed, and nothing, not Republic, Separatists, or even the Sith, could ever return it to what it had been before. The arrival of the Zentradi in the Star Wars galaxy had rewritten the rules of engagement, strategy, and survival. They were no ordinary invaders. They were a living, adaptive force whose decisions flowed from collective cognition rather than centralized command. Through their interactions with both Republic and Separatist forces, Jedi and Sith alike, they challenged every assumption the galaxy had held about power, warfare, and hierarchy. Battles that had once relied on predictable tactics became exercises in adaptation, as the Zentradi demonstrated the ability to learn and evolve in real time. Their presence forced the Republic to reconsider military doctrine, compelled the Separatists to acknowledge the limits of their mechanized armies, and even tested the Sith's confidence in manipulation and control. Yet the Zentradi were more than a test of military might. They interacted with local ecosystems, planetary technologies, and sentient species in ways that hinted at an emergent intelligence capable of understanding, if not empathy. This duality, warrior and observer, conqueror and learner, created a new paradigm in which survival and adaptation, rather than dominance, became the ultimate expression of power. The galaxy, for the first time in its long history of conflict, was confronting an entity that could neither be coerced nor entirely understood. The Jedi, attuned to the Force, sensed the subtle harmonics of this new life force, moments where the Zentradi's decisions resonated with light and dark alike, hinting at an unprecedented connection between biology, consciousness, and the mystical currents that bound the stars. For individual characters, the Zentradi's presence was transformative. Jedi like Anakin Skywalker faced dilemmas beyond combat, navigating the implications of an adaptive species capable of influencing the Force itself. Sith manipulators such as Darth Sidious encountered variables beyond their control, forcing them to shift schemes and accept uncertainty in ways they had never before tolerated. Even the most rigid commanders, both Republic and Separatist, discovered that their strategies could be rendered obsolete by a species whose evolution occurred in real time and outside the constraints of galactic tradition. Ultimately, the Zentradi did not seek to dominate, enslave, or annihilate. They sought understanding, adaptation, and survival. Their philosophy, emerging from countless battles and self-determined choices, revealed a profound lesson. Power was not measured solely by force of arms, but by the ability to evolve, to integrate knowledge, and to act autonomously in a universe defined by uncertainty. They became a permanent fixture in the galactic tapestry, an unpredictable yet stabilizing force whose influence would ripple across generations of star systems, Jedi teachings, and political landscapes. The galaxy would never be the same. Wars, alliances, and strategies had shifted in ways that could never be undone. The presence of the Zentradi marked a turning point, a convergence of alien ingenuity and the Force that expanded the boundaries of possibility. Their emergence was a reminder that even in a galaxy bound by centuries of tradition, laws, and conflict, the unknown could arrive to reshape everything. The Star Wars galaxy had been tested, and while scars remained, a new equilibrium was forming, one defined not by domination or submission, but by coexistence, adaptability, and the ongoing evolution of life itself. And so, the story of the Zentradi's entry into this galaxy ended not with conquest or subjugation, but with the quiet understanding that the cosmos was larger, more complex, and more unpredictable than anyone had dared imagine. They were here to stay, not as overlords, but as catalysts for transformation. The future, uncertain and dynamic, awaited the ripple effects of their choices, their evolution, and the lessons they left behind for all who called the galaxy home.
The multiverse doesn't end here. New invasions, new empires, and new worlds collide daily. If you enjoy deep cinematic, what-if scenarios like this, subscribe and join Multiverse Galaxy if